There's also a large anti-science perception amongst particularly members of the media.
In August, our own Tim O'Brien talked with science writer and advocate Shawn Otto. They talked about global warming. Since then, a United Nations report was issued that said the world's oceans are growing more acidic at a faster rate than expected. They say our oceans are becoming hot, sour, and breathless as they absorb larger and larger amounts of airborne carbon. Now, the recent giant typhoons, hurricanes, and violent weather are all tragic warning signs. Yet most of us avoid the facts. Policymakers seem to be very stuck in tar sands. Here's Shawn Otto with Tim O'Brien.
Isn't there a move afoot, and I think it's reflected in your book. In fact, I know it's reflected in your book. It's not just benign neglect. Aren't certain elements of the political establishment out there taking on science as something that people should be able to rely upon?
Oh, absolutely.
Why is that?
Well, generally it's vested interests whose interests are contradicted.
Economic interests?
A lot of times it's economic interests, sometimes it's ideological interests. For instance, there's considerable evidence to show that human beings who are conceived by in vitro fertilization, what we used to call test tube babies, do have souls. And yet the Catholic Church, at one point in time, campaigned quite vehemently against that idea.
Aren't we talking about in excess of 1 million people that were conceived under that circumstance?
Yes. So any time that topics that are science related, for instance, evolution, the reality of it, versus creationism, whether or not creationism ought to be taught in science classes, as many fundamentalists believe. Any time that there's a conflict between what we're learning from knowledge and our long-held, cherished ideological beliefs, that threatens a certain vested interest, and those people will campaign against science. Now that also happens economically, and we're seeing that a good deal, particularly on the largest economic issue that science has posed, which is climate change.
It astounds me, and your book would reflect, and I'm sure you share the sentiment, that to use a Rush Limbaugh phrase, the mainstream media takes people's statement, Michelle Bachmann, for example, at face value when they talk about the fact that, or their opinion that creationism is a viable alternative to the theory of evolution. Why are reporters, I know they are, but why do you think they're not rebutting that kind of nonsense in their stories?
There is an attitude among the press, and it's taught in every journalism school, that there is no such thing as objective truth. And if you Google that phrase and you search for it, you will find lots and lots of news outlets even that list this in reporter guidelines, journalism schools that list it, famous news reporters that talk about how there's no such thing as objective truth.
Tell me what objective truth means. I mean, I think I understand it, but I don't. I want to make sure I understand your definition of it.
Objective truth is something that can be tested. And the truth of it established independent of the viewer, independent of the person, independent of all the qualities that make you or I a person, our gender, our sexual orientation, our age, our race, our beliefs, our personalities, our opinions, our political affiliations. What science seeks to do is strip all that aside, and what we can determine or measure independent of those things and test, and other people can test and challenge, and it still survives those tests, that is what we call objective truth.
And that would be opposed to, say, for example, a theory, like a theory of evolution? Is that...
No, a theory in science is actually one of the strongest forms of truth that we have. When we say theory, and this is something that opponents of various forms of science use a lot, is the difference between colloquial uses of the word theory and the scientific use. In science, a theory is the one explanation that has stood up to every test that has been thrown at it. So it's some of the strongest type of knowledge that we can find as human beings. To answer your question about reporters, where they run into trouble on this question is, it's fair enough to say that your truth and my truth are different when it comes to matters of political opinion, our life experiences, our takes on what just happened as witnesses if there was a car crash, something like that. That's true enough. But more and more of our policy issues in the United States are coming to revolve around science-driven questions. For instance, the reality of climate change. That is an objective truth. We measure that with instruments placed all over the world, and we've measured it billions and billions and billions of times now. So to portray one person who is speaking on one half of the TV, who is basing their comments on the sum total of knowledge that scientists have established over the last 50 years, measuring climate change and learning to understand what is driving it, and then to put another person on the other half of the screen who is voicing an opinion that is based on their ideas or their ideology, but is not based on all of those thousands of other scientists' work, that is creating what we call a false balance. And that false balance is skewing our public debate away from knowledge and towards ideological extremes. And that's a good part of the reason why we're seeing so much gridlock in Washington right now.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers through DFL Senate District 48, Eden Prairie, and Minnetonka. Sharon Boreen, Chair.